Story 1. It was spring. The snow had just melted, and I sent my dog outside. All the previously snow-covered dog waste piles that had accumulated over the winter were now melted and available. So he took the opportunity to eat every single one of them. He came inside, waited a little while, and vomited all over the living room carpet. Rest in peace to anyone with a worse story. Story 2. The event ended in sudden death. A woman had died in front of her television about 5 days earlier. She had a small 3-bar electric heater a couple of feet away that was still on. All the windows were closed, and it was summer. Pungent is a word. Story 3. When I was a medical student, I did a pathology rotation, and part of it was at the morgue. There was a woman who lived in her car and had been dead for several days before anyone noticed. When they opened her abdomen for the autopsy, most of her bowels had become necrotic. Dead tissue, feces, and overgrown anaerobic bacteria created an unbearable smell. I am a surgeon and have seen a lot of difficult cases in the operating room. That autopsy, which took place 40 years ago, still holds the record for the worst thing I have ever smelled. Story 4. When I was married, my wife and I were moving. She told me she had cleaned out the freezer in the garage that we used to keep meat in and that she unplugged it. It sat with 2 full turkeys inside, closed, for over 6 weeks in Texas before we moved. It was now August. When that freezer was opened even slightly, I vomited immediately. Story 5. Homeless patients. Some of them do not shower for years and wear the same clothes they bleed into or relieve themselves in. The smell is overwhelming to the point that it fills the room and extends into the hallway. It is very sad. Story 6. Forgotten milk bottle in a car. 2 weeks in the sun. Opened the cap and immediately threw up on the spot. It smelled like sour cheese and despair. Story 7. I was visiting a farm that had a bird influenza outbreak, wiping out hundreds of chickens during a county-wide burn ban. The carcasses had been sitting for weeks in the Texas summer heat before they were able to be burned. It was horrible. Story 8. Necrobacillosis is a bacterial infection of livestock, especially sheep, where their feet essentially rot. My father was a veterinarian, and he cleaned the infected areas by removing the dead, rotten tissue and applying medication to stop the infection. Whenever he did this, I had to leave the entire area to stay away from the powerful, unpleasant stench. Story 9. Fortunately, I have never had to deal with a human corpse, but I have encountered multi-month rotted animal carcasses off the side of the street because very small rural areas do not receive priority from the county. I am the mail carrier, so I have to stay around and endure that situation. Story 10. A chef I was assigned to work with for an in-home catering job forgot to tell me that he spilled a gallon of vanilla creamer all over the fabric liner in my trunk. It sat and baked in the sun for hours until we finished the job. My car smelled like sickly sweet spoiled milk vomit for years whenever I did not have the windows rolled down, despite having it professionally cleaned and detailed multiple times. I still gag when I think about it. Story 11. I work in a wastewater treatment plant where we receive numerous dead organisms and debris through the pipes. I am fairly certain I have developed an immunity to unpleasant odors at this point in my life. Story 12. I came across a reindeer carcass once. Even though it was below freezing outside, the smell was as you would expect. I saw a homeless-looking woman once. She looked fairly normal, but as I passed by, I smelled urine and some of the worst body odor I have ever encountered. The combination was horrible. I immediately started thinking of a reindeer carcass to get the smell out of my mind. Story 13. A skunk took up residence in my mom's friend's garage and sprayed inside. Sadly, that actually changed my tolerance for skunk spray. He used to only smell like a really bad fart, but now it smells like a bad fart plus sulfur on fire. Story 14. Vomit, blood, urine, feces, body odor, and alcohol, all from one person. I worked at a gas station in college. A mile down the road was a small nursing home. A woman who lived there, who was mentally impaired, was also a severe alcoholic. Her family would bring her bottles of wine, and the staff would beg them not to, as they limited how much she was allowed to drink. Understanding she was an alcoholic, they gave her wine in the evenings and a bit during the day. They kept her extra wine bottles locked away in a closet. One day, she was unsupervised and the closet was left unlocked. She got inside, drank an entire bottle in one go, took another, and walked out of the facility. She drank that next bottle and had an eventful couple of hours. She soiled herself, urinated on herself, vomited on herself, fell, and cut her head. By the time she came into my store, she looked like a homeless person. We had a homeless camp nearby, so drunk homeless people were common. Here is where my experience begins. She walked in, looking dirty and a little drunk. Then the smell hit me. Everything the human body can do to produce odor, this woman was doing. The door was about 20 feet from the counter, but within seconds, I started gagging. I realized it had to be her. She approached the counter with a bottle of wine. This woman, it turns out, was a professional drinker. She was steady, her speech was almost clear, and she smiled like she was sober. She sounded sober. If it weren't for the smell of alcohol, I wouldn't have thought she was drunk. She approached the counter, smelling horrible, and I had a choice to make. Do I deny this woman alcohol and potentially have an argument that could last minutes? That was common when denying alcohol to homeless people, whom I assume she was. Or do I sell her the alcohol and get her out of the store as quickly as possible? I am not proud to say I took her money and wished her a good night while swallowing a surge of vomit in my throat. I was 21 years old and working nights, so cut me some slack. Anyway, she left. Her smell did not leave. A man walked in a few moments later, made a gagging sound, and immediately left. It was exactly like the SpongeBob reaction image. I tore open multiple car air fresheners and placed them around the store, spraying air freshener everywhere I could and disinfecting what I could. Now the store smelled of vomit, blood, feces, urine, wine, and vanilla. Took 2 hours before her smell left the store. Months later, my manager told me the lady's backstory. Years before, she had done the same thing. Walked into the store, sat on a bench, urinated on herself, and then left. What a world. Story 15. Came home from a weekend away and someone had knocked over a fox at some point and carefully laid it out of the way where our driveway met our back garden fence. It had been there in the sun during the day long enough for a scavenger to rip it open. It was rotting and covered in maggots and flies. This was about a decade ago, and I can still smell it when I think about it. Story 16. Rotten coconut at a coconut shy. The smell overwhelmed the nostrils. Truly impressive how badly it reeked. Story 17. A girl on a bus had a horrendous perfume trying to cover her body odor. She sat right next to me. Then we passed a farm with a large amount of manure outside. I almost vomited from the mix of all the smells. Story 18. My brother had severe burns. He was hit by a school bus while riding his motorcycle. The court determined that the bus driver was at fault. He was knocked out and pinned down, with the bike's exhaust lying on his leg for almost a minute. Story 19. The dumpster behind the grocery store where I worked as a child was the nastiest thing I have ever smelled. That is saying a lot because I was a plumber and have been inside a giant septic tank, and that did not smell as bad. Story 20. Semen-saturated clothing that was washed in a sink but left undried, then stuffed into a backpack for an unknown number of days. Grotesque. Story 21. In the early 2000s, I worked in the camera department at Best Buy. A woman came in, and I approached her to see if she needed help. When I got within 10 feet, a wall of putrid stench hit me. She was an older woman using a cane. I can only imagine that she had some kind of necrosis or something on her foot because the smell was so strong it stayed in my nose until I went home and showered. Story 22. The trash compactor and storage unit at Walmart had a blockage. They lowered me inside, and it was a mix of everything found at Walmart. A particularly unpleasant smell was present, reminiscent of rotting baby food and possibly soiled diapers. I was never the same after that. Story 23. Dead body that flies and maggots had propagated in. We found her after a couple of weeks. I smelled it for about 2 months afterward. Randomly, it will hit me, and I have to catch my breath. Whenever I smell an ozone machine, it brings the scent right back. Story 24. My dog found a pile of minnow bait that had been lying out for a day or so, rolled in it, and then jumped in the truck. Awful smell. Story 25. 20 years ago, I was a youth counselor, and one of my responsibilities was to take troubled youths out fishing, hiking, and other activities. There was a plot of woods and fields with ponds that I thought would be cool to explore. This place was like a maze. It felt kind of strange, and it seemed like someone was watching us. We turned a corner and were hit with the smell of death. Apparently, the county dumped all its roadkill and illegal poaching kills in this field. The pile was about 20 feet tall and 50 feet wide, containing every mammal you can think of, including some black bears. For some reason, there was a decapitated bear head a few feet from the pile. Swarms of flies sounded like a buzzsaw. The kid and I almost threw up and then literally ran away. The place felt evil. I had never felt emotionally that sick before, as if the presence of evil was there. Story 26. I do not know if it was the most horrid, but it was certainly the most memorable. I used to commute from eastern Long Island to Manhattan and back every day for work. It was a soul-sucking nightmare in general, but one day, a man jumped into the middle seat next to me. I had the window seat. I looked up from my book, and he smiled and said, "Hi." I was immediately engulfed by a wave of pure, malodorous foulness. I am insufficiently eloquent to describe how revolting and nauseating his breath was. I recoiled reflexively so hard that I slammed my head into the window beside me and stunned myself. The death breath, as I had already dubbed him, said, Hey, are you all right?" With each word, another wave of putrescent corruption washed over me. All I could do was hold my breath and turn away. Eventually, it became too much to bear, and I had to stand up and flee to another seat in a different car where I would no longer have to smell that god-awful stench. Story 27. Recovered a rotting sea lion that had been sitting on the sand for 2 days in front of the resort where I worked. They are heavier than you would expect. Story 28. Rotting flesh. I used to work armed security at a public transit hub in a city with a high homeless population. Most of the homeless people were addicted to fentanyl or other drugs. A woman came in asking for us to call an ambulance as she was bleeding down her side from an unknown event. She was an addict, and the drug she used made her fingers and arms turn into bloody, exposed flesh, which then rotted. There was a horrible smell. Story 29. I previously worked as a delivery driver for a rent-to-own company. A woman in community housing had rented a washer and dryer from us and told us that the washer was not working. I went to her basement, and the machine was still full of water and half-washed clothes with the lid locked. We brought her a loaner machine while we contacted a technician to come and fix the washer. For months passed, and we still had not heard from the technician. The woman called us to pick up the broken washer. I arrived, and it was still in the exact spot in her basement, full of the same clothes and water as before. This time, the lid was unlocked. I opened it and was greeted by a putrid, vomit-inducing sewage smell. The machine had sat there with half-washed clothes in mildewy water in an unair-conditioned basement for 4 months, including a terrible heat wave that lasted weeks. Story 30. In high school, a student put a chocolate milk in his locker on the top shelf and then forgot about it over the Christmas break. A few weeks later, when we returned, he opened his locker, the bottle fell, and splattered all over the hallway. The entire school smelled terrible for about a week after that. Story 31. When I was in school, I was hit by a motorcycle. Nothing major. While waiting in the emergency room, I smelled something putrid but couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Then a doctor walked toward a man, and that man pulled out his leg and unwrapped his foot, which until then seemed to be wrapped in medical bandages. It turned out that the man had diabetes and his foot was necrotic. I saw his black foot, and the tips of his toes had bones poking out. The foot was completely rotten. The most horrid smell came when the man released his foot from the wraps. The stench of death filled the emergency room. It was terrible. Story 32. I clean the offices at the water and sewer department. There is a large roll-off container they call the can, which transports sludge from the bottom of the sewer lagoon. The smell of the can baking in the sun is unbearable. Story 33. I'm not saying this to be coarse, but honestly, My deceased neighbor's situation was distressing. The elderly next-door neighbor collapsed and died overnight. She was sizable and had become wedged against the bed when she fell. I had to forcibly roll her to perform chest compressions, and the smell from her body when I did so was overwhelming. Story 34. I volunteered as an emergency medical technician before I moved. We received a call on Monday to go to an apartment for a wellness check. When we arrived, the firefighter greeted us. "Yeah, he's dead." I opened the door and recognized the smell from being in the woods around animal carcasses. But there was something different. The man was face down, dark gray, just light enough to see his tattoos, with fluids leaking from his mouth. He was last seen on Friday, and we had a heat wave over the weekend. He weighed almost 400 pounds, and we had to get him downstairs. His body was a fly paradise. Somehow, his eyeballs hadn't exploded, but they were going to. I remember we flipped him on his back to put him in the body bag and on the scoop stretcher to transport him with the coroner. The fluids that collected on his face made an audible sucking sound as they went down his throat. That affected me. One firefighter said, "You gotta throw up," and I told him loudly, "I haven't eaten today. I don't think I physically can." I smelled that sporadically for about 10 days. Like a sneak attack, it could happen at any point. If I was in the shower and sniffed just right, I caught a whiff. Story 35. Honestly, when one of my friends pulled his pants down while changing, all you could smell was body odor. It was awful. Story 36. I was helping a relative tear down an old wooden grocery store. One of the guys helping stepped in an old rotten egg. It was as if the oxygen was immediately replaced by the smell, deep in my sinuses. After a few days, I smelled roadkill, but that was nothing compared to the rotten egg. Story 37. The water in Iceland was unbearable. I couldn't shower without heaving throughout. I had to hold my breath while the water was running, then immediately turn off the shower and open the door to breathe between steps. Story 38. I knew someone who did not shower for weeks or months at a time. When they went to the store, the smell would fill multiple aisles and eventually the entire building. He had his own form of social distancing. It was rancid. Story 39. Okay, time for too much information. I, a 48-year-old male, had this weird abscess in my groin area. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but within 3 weeks it swelled my left scrotum to about the size of a navel orange. It was painful, itchy, and sticky all at once. Approaching week 4, I had been using hot packs, cold packs, antibiotics, the works. But close to week 4, it burst, and it burst badly. Bad enough that I didn't even feel it happen. I smelled it and felt it leaking fluid badly enough to make me run upstairs while holding myself, get my clothes off, and jump in the shower. For the next 20 minutes, I oozed what I think was around 2 cups of this infected tan, green, and purple pus, blood, and plasma mixture that stunk up the entire house, both floors. I gagged multiple times while draining it. That was the worst smell ever. Story 40. Caribbean flamingo excrement. For the longest time, I worked in a house nicknamed the cat excrement house. Years after working there, it literally had a pile of cat excrement every 6 inches from the kitchen sink to every windowsill. I worked as a zoo water quality specialist. It was one of the only exhibits where we were not allowed to treat the water with ozone, according to the head zoologist. We used beneficial bacteria in the exhibit and needed to test the population quarterly by retrieving samples from a massive sand filter. One of the tests was performed in August in southern Florida. 3 other people and I would pool straws to see who would retrieve the sample. I lost the pool twice in the 5 years I was there. We would put mentholated ointment on cotton swabs and wear full-face respirators, yet somehow the smell still made its way in. Brazilian lesser flamingos are similar but ranked 4th on the list. 1. Caribbean flamingos have a shrimp diet to maintain their pink color. 2. The depression and alcohol-related house nicknamed the cat excrement house. 3. My youngest brother's excrement cleared out a mansion we were working on due to lactose intolerance and a severe sensitivity to dairy. 4. Brazilian lesser flamingos have a brine diet that gives them a beautiful gray-pink color. Story 41. A tractor trailer that had a dump box broke its back welds on the tailgate, and dumped its load in the street right outside my office. The load was about 20 tons of rotting hog carcasses in the middle of a heat wave on the way to a rendering plant. The carcasses were partially liquefied from the heat and decomposition. They exploded when they hit the street. Story 42. Walking home from school on a Monday in a very rural area, I passed a truck 3 feet from the road that reeked. Black liquid was oozing out from the driver's door. Windows were covered in maggots. A friend and I went to investigate and saw a man bloated, with his head exploded, bugs everywhere. His skin was ripped open like a sausage cooking. The smell still haunts me decades later. This was in a tropical climate with temperatures above 95 degrees. I called the police when I got home. We found out later the man had killed himself the previous Wednesday and sat in the truck cooking the whole time. Rotting death has a very unique smell. Once you smell it, you instantly know it is something dead. Story 43. I was working at a liquor store and somehow the pipe trap in the toilet got drained. So we had a direct connection to the sewage line. We ended up telling people not to come in because the smell was so bad until we fixed it a few hours later. Story 44. A few years ago, I had a sack of potatoes in a top cabinet. They had been there a few weeks, but not too long. When I pulled them out, they were all rotting, liquefied, and maggot-infested. I was so disgusted that I dropped some out of the bag, and they fell on my kitchen floor, exploding into a liquefied goo of rot. It was very gross. I guess I got bug-infested potatoes because they weren't that old. Story 45. Simply put, my mother had a bad habit of buying many ingredients to cook with, but only ever cooked pre-made food. At one point, when I was still young, my father came home from deployment and insisted she finally clean out the refrigerator for the first time since we got it. I do not know what was in that storage container, but it was very close to my face when we opened it. Story 46. Booked to do work in a house. We assumed the owner had died. There was a strong smell of cat urine already, and out of sheer curiosity, my coworker and I opened the fridge. I don't know how old the fridge was, but a wave of absolutely vile-smelling air wafted out into the house. Story 47. A few years ago, my dad placed 2 uncovered rotisserie chicken carcasses in our outdoor trash can. This was during summer, and we went on a trip the following week, which created a gap of about 10 to 12 days without trash collection. During that time, the chickens sat in the can in the heat. When we returned and opened the trash can, it emitted the foulest smell I have ever experienced. It was difficult to describe. We ended up having to get a new trash can from the city because the odor was so strong and had absorbed into the can. Story 48. A deceased citizen had been left to decompose for 3 months in the summer. Flies covered the curtains, and his body had fused with the floor. The doctor refused to enter but declared him dead outside. Story 49. I work in an intensive care unit. I had a patient once whose emergency medical services were called by a neighbor after hearing groaning coming from the apartment. Emergency medical services broke down the door and found the patient slumped back on the couch, soaked in diarrhea and menstrual blood. She had a stroke at some point that left her unable to move, and the air conditioning had gone out during the peak of summer. The smell of sweaty burned skin mixed with liquid feces and menstrual blood was so strong that nurses were stuffing their face masks with sanitizing wipes before going in. Not as horrific as the rest of these. Story 50. Dead bodies and the stockyards and slaughterhouses across the panhandle of Oklahoma. Miles and miles with no way to get away from it. Story 51. Madras train station in the 90s. I don't know if it has improved since then. It was like a combination of sewer, trash heap, and carrion pit. Story 52. My grandpa was a handyman for the older ladies in town, even though most of them were younger than he was. One of them passed away and left her house to her daughter in Tennessee. They shut off the power and left the house to sit in the California sun for about 6 weeks before she asked Grandpa to clean out the chest freezer in the garage. I have no idea what was in there originally, but when we arrived, it was just mason jars full of black sludge. We spent most of the morning cleaning it out, and I felt like vomiting the entire time. Story 53. Have you ever encountered someone with bad body odor who does not believe in using deodorant and also has trichomycosis? Story 54. When I was in law enforcement, We had to recover the body of a deceased woman who had been murdered and dumped in the woods in North Carolina in July. She had been there for about 2 weeks. Story 55. I was cleaning up a barn during a work experience, and when I walked in, the stench of sheep feces, urine, and birthing fluids was horrible. Story 56. Rotting corpse of a deer. Best guess it was roadkill, then run over repeatedly, then pushed off to the side of the road and never collected. It was brief as I drove past, but so intense it made my eyes water. Story 57. Dropped my friend off at a doctor's appointment when he came to visit. I had to urinate, so I went into that building's bathroom. That was when I truly learned what taste the stink with your eyes meant. Story 58. Old grease trap that was full and had not been used for years. When it was opened, everyone left the building. Story 59. I was in emergency medical services as a paramedic for more than a decade. The only smell that has ever made me gag wasn't from a medical call. The city of Denver offers municipal composting and provides a bin to collect your scraps for the week. The man who owned my house before we bought it had a pet rabbit. A large one. We moved in the middle of July during record heat. The previous owner kept the compost bin in the sun in the backyard, where temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees. Before they left, they put the rabbit's litter in the compost bin. They moved out. I spent a few days cleaning and doing maintenance. Then I moved my belongings in. The next day, I left on a week-long road trip. The Thursday after I returned was trash day, so I opened the bin to see if it was empty or if I needed to put it in the alley. The smell was indescribably putrid. I immediately retched, slammed the lid shut, and moved away. I had to move the bin to the back, and every bump made the top open again, causing me to retch again. I've smelled many things. Corpses that have ripened for a week, intestines open through trauma, bad things. I have never in my life been hit so powerfully by a smell. Thinking about it years later, I can still feel it. Story 60. There is a cologne/perfume called Inexcusable Evil. Here is the description. Top notes are gunpowder and ozonic notes. Middle notes are blood, iodine, flowers, copaiba balm, cypriol oil or nagarmotha, and guaiac wood. Base notes are concrete. Curious, I ordered a small split, a fraction from a full-size bottle sent in a vial. The description does not do it justice. My wife felt ill, I hated it, the dogs hated it, and I gave it to my friend who works for haunted houses. Look it up and read the reviews. It is absolutely sharp, cutting, cloying, and vile. It is a smell I would not have been able to imagine or conceive without having experienced it. Here are some sample reviews. Pus-filled ward of a hospital. Only gets worse as it settles when the sterile disinfectant component wears off, and you are left with the smell of body fluids and disease. This is the worst smell I have ever experienced, and as a healthcare worker who has routinely smelled feces, vomit, urine, and blood, that is really saying something. It smells like fearing death. And stinky. Edit to add would recommend. It is a wild trip. Story 61. Not just a smell, and going by smell alone, maybe not the worst, but definitely the worst I remember. I was visiting my niece once and had to throw up. I ran to the bathroom, opened the toilet, and just from the combination of sight and smell, I no longer had to throw up. Apparently, she and her boyfriend had not cleaned it since they moved in. Story 62. Ethane thiol, also known as ethyl mercaptan, is one of the components of skunk spray. I had to use it in the drug testing laboratory where I worked. Story 63. Grandma was getting old and did not make it down to the basement very often, so she did not notice that the 8-foot chest freezer, stuffed full, had stopped functioning as a freezer. It was a couple of months before anyone investigated the smell. A half-face respirator with 3M chemical cartridges and a large fan pulling air out the window above the freezer were no match for the rotting meat, fish, vegetables, and whatever else was in that foul mess. Story 64. I used to work for a restaurant supply company. We provided towels, aprons, floor mats, grill pads, and more. I serviced the account once a week to collect dirty items and drop off clean supplies. Microfiber rags used by Starbucks to clean sugary syrups and dairy might not seem too bad. but they were placed in a plastic wheelie bin outside in the Texas summer sun. The cooked dairy and syrup produced a sickeningly sweet smell that hit my nose harder than the time I hosted a burn ward. It was just a vile combination. Story 65. When I was 6 years old, I found my uncle hanging in the attic from a belt. He had committed suicide 8 days earlier and was decomposing and very bloated. It was a hot July, and the heat made the smell stick to your clothes. As I got close to the top of the steps, I almost couldn't continue, but curiosity kept me going. He smelled like nothing I have ever smelled since. It opened my eyes and traumatized my young mind. As an adult, I can still recognize that smell anywhere. Story 66. A friend committed suicide in his garage in Texas on July 4, 2016. I found him 13 days later. The smell will never leave me. I felt like I couldn't take long enough showers to wash off the scent for months. The smell of cheap cat litter is now a trigger for me. We initially thought he wasn't home because his truck was left on the side of the highway with the keys inside. We found it weeks later. It wasn't unusual for us to go a couple of weeks without chatting. I had to spend several hours in the garage where he died to clear it out, as his parents were estranged. When they took his body, they cut out the drywall behind him and painted over the cleaned fluids with gray paint. The paint was morbidly comical because they only covered what was necessary, leaving a gray reminder of the mess. Finding a tooth and a piece of his jaw on a box about 20 feet away was the moment that finally made me vomit and curse his name. I miss him and love him, but he really stunk up the place. Knowing him, I'm sure we would have had a good laugh about the smell. Check on your friends and remind them you love them. Story 67. Had to clean out a refrigeration unit that my work forgot had shorted out before it was replaced. The problem was that whoever removed it forgot to take all the food out, which was left rotting inside for 3 months. This allowed the smell to ferment and become trapped airtight. I had to run to the restroom and empty my lunch before confronting the person responsible and then getting extra prepared to clean it thoroughly. Story 68. I am in the medical field, and 2 horrific smells come to mind. 1. An abdominal surgical case with dead bowel, and 2. Chest pus with empyema requiring a chest tube. I will never forget either and am not sure which was worse. Story 69. I was in my late teens and working as a line cook for a chain restaurant. It was poorly managed and stock regularly went bad. A new general manager was hired, the kitchen manager was fired, and a few of us were required to work after hours to clean the kitchen, including the walk-in cooler and line coolers. I was pulling items out of the walk-in cooler and noticed an unlabeled, undated container of something. My heart sank, but my curiosity was piqued. I immediately regretted my action when I opened it, as the overwhelming smell of rancid decay hit my nose before I even saw what it was. I threw up. The other 2 guys threw up moments later. It was hard to tell what kind of meat it was, as it was green and mostly goop, but the best guess was chicken breasts that had been there for a year or more. We evacuated the kitchen and informed the new manager that we were done for the night. The kitchen was closed for lunch the next day, and I was off for the next 2 days. I returned reluctantly, but you wouldn't have known that the rotting remains of many animals had been disturbed in that space just days before. I still associate walk-in coolers with that stench. Story 70. Sheep died on my friend's farm while he was in another country. I thought I'd be a good mate and bury it for him. It was rotten and fell apart when trying to lift it into the hole. Guts, lungs, maggots everywhere. Definitely the worst I have smelled. Story 71. Reusable fly trap with liquid inside. Had it up for a few weeks and caught at least 100 dead flies. Emptied it into my toilet. The worst smell ever. Had to leave a candle burning in the bathroom for hours to try to get the smell to go away. Story 72. When I was 16, I went deep-sea fishing. I packed a bunch of coolers with the cleaned fish and dropped them off at home on my way back to summer camp. 6 weeks later, I went to my parked car, noticed a weird smell, and opened an empty cooler. I vomited all over the interior of my car. Story 73. Working at a large grocery store warehouse. There was a day when the trash compactor was recently loaded with expired and rotten meat, onions, potatoes, fruit, and squash. I was throwing trash in, and the smell wafted out, causing all of us working nearby to instantly vomit. Most of us made it to the trash cans nearby, but others vomited on the floor. It was probably the worst smell I have ever encountered. Story 74. Tyson Plant. The trucks carrying live hogs squealing on top of the overwhelming combination of bacon and death. It is really bad. Story 75. When I was a child, I left a container of fishing bait worms in the back seat of my father's car. This was during the summer in South Carolina for 3 days. He found them when he went to work. Story 76. I was riding my bicycle in town and stopped at a light. I smelled something stomach-churning. I looked around and saw that I was next to a crematorium, with smoke coming out of a chimney on top. Story 77. A man whose legs were rotten to the bone refused treatment. The smell traveled all the way down the hall to the registered nurse station, probably 50 to 60 feet. An N95 mask with an essential oil inhaler against my face did not help. Story 78. A damp skin yeast infection, not a vaginal one, but a severe skin infection. That condition causes me to have a strong emotional reaction. Story 79. A lung abscess was being drained under computed tomography guidance. The radiologist had a habit of dipping his finger in everything and making the technician smell it. Story 80. One of my friends passed gas about 25 years ago, and it was so bad. I have smelled rotting animal corpses before and all sorts of unpleasant things, but somehow that was worse because it did not waft or linger. It was an immediate assault on the senses, like getting pepper sprayed. Story 81. Waterlogged corpse. One of my neighbors had a heart attack and died in his bathtub. You will never forget that smell once you experience it. Story 82. We had a deep freeze cooler full of frozen ground beef that we used to feed the dogs. One unfortunate summer, my father-in-law broke it while chipping away at some meat with a hammer. He unplugged the freezer and left it in the sweltering hot garage until we had enough garbage for a dump run. Eventually, he asked me and my mother-in-law to take it to the dump, warning us not to open it. After pushing it off the trailer, I was about to say goodbye to this freezer forever when curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to open it for a sniff. Biggest regret of my life. Saying it smelled like death is an understatement. I instantly started dry heaving and fought hard not to vomit. The smell lingered in the air and in my nostrils. 10 out of 10 would not recommend. Story 83. Top worst things I have ever smelled. 4. A man's rotting leg. 3. Barrels of feces being burned with jet fuel. 2. A dump my father took when I was a teenager. 1. A container of Canadian nightcrawlers that were left in the sun until they had melted together. Story 84. My friend's brother had passed away, and I agreed to take care of their mother's hair since I am a hairstylist. I unclipped her hair, thinking it was wet. It was saturated with scalp oils to the point of looking completely wet. I knew she was mentally ill, but her hair had probably not been washed for months. She seemed groomed otherwise. The smell burned my nostrils and hit the back of my throat. I had to go to the back and collect myself. I proceeded to wash her hair several times. Even after I colored it, the smell came through when I blow-dried her hair. Story 85. I had an old pickup truck for years and decided to fix it up and do some long overdue maintenance. One thing I was not expecting was the powerful foul stench that came from the differential fluid I drained out of the rear axle. I have smelled rotting dead animals that were not as bad as that fluid smell. Story 86. I washed my shoes that were completely covered in blood in a small bucket. After washing them, the water smelled absolutely horrible. The shoes had been covered in blood for over a month before washing. I almost threw up. Story 87. A homeless person who smelled like alcohol and urine slept in a self-service area. The crotch of his jeans was wet, and his behind was stained. Story 88. Bovine intestines that have been in 25-degree heat all day produce a strong odor that overwhelms you and makes you lose your breath. Story 89. Someone spilled milk in the trunk of a rental car. It took about a week to figure out where the smell was coming from, by which time the summer heat had intensified the odor significantly. Story 90. The truck that emptied the portable toilets in Camp Arifjan in Kuwait during the summer. Camp Arifjan was close to the ocean, so even though it was the desert, it was still humid in the summer. The truck hauled gallons and gallons of waste in 120-degree weather in air you could taste. When it drove by on a summer day, the smell was so bad you could taste it in the back of your throat. Story 91. Rotting flesh smell is the worst, in my opinion. Anything that can make a nurse nauseous is truly unpleasant. I once had a golf ball-sized cyst on my back, and during its removal, it ruptured. The smell filled the room, and the nurse got splattered in the face and left immediately. Do not know if she vomited, but I was gagging just being in the room. I cannot imagine how much worse the smell would be if your face was covered with dead skin cells and oils. Dead, rotting animals or people have an even worse odor. Both smells cling to your sinuses in the most unpleasant way. Story 92. Garage freezer. Power went out while we were on vacation, and all the turkeys, meat, and other items melted and became a giant soup of spoilage. Had to remove it with a wet/dry vacuum. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.